Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Eleanor Suster, and I am Head of Transformative Agreements at Taylor & Francis, and I'm really delighted and excited to be here today. So in my presentation, I'm going to be talking about our Transformative Agreement program at Taylor & Francis and analysing some of the impact and influence that we have seen through these agreements, both at a high level, in aggregate, and through some case studies. And at TNF, we believe open research is an extremely effective and impactful way to advance research that enriches lives. Open access is, of course, a key element of this, and we want to make it a realistic choice for researchers and institutions across different disciplines and regions, and our Transformative Agreement and Open Access Agreements are one way of doing this. So at Taylor & Francis, we want to demonstrate to our library partners and the wider research community how research made open is having the widest and broadest possible impact. And what do we mean by impact? And does it mean different things to different stakeholders? So I'm going to look at more traditional metrics such as citations through to altmetric insights on social media, global downloads, and impact on policy. And this presentation will show how these types of transformative agreements can facilitate increased influence in different areas, focusing especially on articles published in humanities and social sciences, or HSS, subject areas. So first, I'd like to set our agreements in context to the wider work that we're doing at Taylor & Francis in open research. So transformative agreements are one part of our broader open research strategy designed to enable researchers to choose open with us, whether that's open access publishing through a transformative agreement, or perhaps through publishing in one of our fully open access journals, choosing open data, as all of our journals have a data sharing policy, or through open peer review, through publishing on F1000 Research, for example, which operates an open post-publication peer review workflow. So to begin, a brief overview of Taylor & Francis' recent developments and investment in openness, starting with a green open access policy in 2003, our first hybrid journals in 2006, moving to OA Books options with Routledge in 2013. And in 2016, TNF signed a first transformative open access agreement with the Dutch consortium VSNU. F1000 Research, an open research publishing platform that some of you may be familiar with, joined Taylor & Francis in 2020. And in 2021, we launched our data sharing policy for books, and we're the first publisher to do so. And as you can see on the right there, as of now, we have over 500 institutions, part of transformative agreements, through over 20 agreements that we have in place globally. And so I mentioned that I was going to be talking about humanities and social sciences, but why are we focusing on this specifically? So Taylor & Francis is very strong in these disciplines, with over 1,400 hybrid open access HSS journals, which makes it all the more important to have a focus on researchers in these fields. So the topic of creating an open research environment which works well for all subject areas is very important to us as a publisher. So I'm only going to be talking about transformative agreements today, and there is much discussion on this slide and more broadly about other routes to open. But for researchers in fields where APC funding is often more limited, institutional level transformative agreements present one pathway that is showing a clear progress towards open for HSS. So the charts on this slide start to put our transformative agreements into context, showing data from 2018 to 2022 year to date up to the end of September. And the graph on the left-hand side highlights the growth in the number of articles made open access under these agreements at TNF, showing a steady growth trajectory, growing by almost 300% between 2018 and 2021. And the steeper increase on the chart is the start of our transformative agreement with JISC in the UK last year. And the chart on the right shows the breakdown by discipline. So most of our agreements facilitate open access publishing in hybrid journals. So we have over 2,000, as I mentioned, 1,400 in HSS, about 500 science and technical, and about 200 medical. And what this varied portfolio mix enables is a wide range and breadth of content to be made open access through these agreements, but, as I mentioned, with a particular strength in opening up HSS. Our data shows, year on year and overall, that the majority of articles made open access through Taylor & Francis transformative agreements are in these subject areas, areas that typically receive less research funding than STM subject areas. So in fact, 69% of the articles made open access in this time frame under the transformative agreements fall into this HSS category. And that's at a high level, but we do, of course, see that reflected in the output of our individual agreements. So, for example, with our agreement with the BIBSAM consortium in Sweden, over 2/3 of the content made away fall into this HSS subject category. So overall, the data shows that the contribution these agreements are having as one way in making open options equally available for researchers in social sciences and humanities. So what's the importance of this, and what is the effect and impact that we have seen? So firstly, making articles open access can increase the reach and readership of the research. So at TNF, our research has shown that articles published open access in our hybrid journals that we call Open Select can receive 95% more citations. And this increase in citations is something we've also seen in our transformative agreements. So comparing like-for-like data from 2018 to 2021, so that's the hybrid publishing output of Read and Publish agreement participants in 21 versus those same participants' hybrid publishing output in 2018, we see an increase in the average number of citations per article. And I think this is best demonstrated by looking at one agreement as an example. So the chart on the right-hand side shows the growth in citations by 5 HSS subject areas. The dark blue line is citations in 2020 to articles accepted in 2020, which is the year before the agreement began. And the lighter blue line is citations in 2021 to articles accepted in 2021, the first year of the agreement. And we've restricted to in-year citations because articles that have been published earlier and for longer have obviously had more time to accrue more citations. The biggest gains can be seen in, for example, history, that's had 107% growth in citations, and anthropology, over 170% growth in citations. And many of these disciplines, as I mentioned, have not historically led in open access due to the scarcity of APC funding available. So at that subject level, we can start to see the effect that facilitating OA via the transformative agreements has had, and the benefits this will have for establishing long-term impact for this body of research. And while I'm focusing here on HSS, we have also seen growth in STM subject areas under this example agreement, including mechanical engineering, environmental science, and neurology. And because the barriers to access were removed for these articles under these agreements, we have also started to see growth in altmetric tracked citations. So Altmetric Explorer tracks the sharing of DOIs online, and this is very dynamic and rich data, enabling us to really get a sense of how the articles are being used and engaged with outside the purely scholarly community. So Altmetric collects the relevant discussions around each piece of published research, looking at things like policy documents, mainstream news outlets, post-publication peer review forums, social media, and blogs, for example. So using the same data set as previously, and looking at mentions in year again for the same reasons, we have seen a 3% growth in articles tracked, but a 52% growth in altmetric mentions between these two dates, between 2018 and 2021. So this demonstrates how research being made open is having an impact beyond academia and is being engaged with and debated across a broad range of outlets. Now, additionally, more content is being engaged with. 79% of all tracked 2018 research outputs were mentioned within the year, and that rose by 10% to 89% in 2021. And this, of course, corresponds with a significant growth in in-year mentions by news outlets by over 150%, and over a 50% growth in in-year Twitter mentions. So this shows how these agreements can improve discoverability of research, and raises awareness of the societal impact of the HSS subject fields. And by looking at the breakdown in a more granular fashion by subject area of articles made open access under our agreements from 2020 to 2022, we can see that the top 10 most published subject areas fall under humanities and social sciences subject areas. And why is this important? So I've already spoken briefly about the impact that open access can have on citations and providing access to a wider audience, including the media and policymakers. But there are also wider societal benefits relating to the value of social science and humanities research in general. So the quote on the slide there from Claire Graves of the UK Economic and Social Research Council talks about the vital role of social science research in tackling the COVID-19 pandemic, explaining that there are important cultural issues, behaviours around vaccines, people's freedoms, how people live their lives, and socio-economic challenges. More than ever, people recognise the importance of the social sciences in the challenges. So it highlights why ensuring as many people as possible have access to the research is essential, and the importance of social science research to policymakers. So here's an example article really on exactly what the quote on the previous slide from Claire Graves was saying about the intersection between the science and medicine under COVID and the societal impact. So this article was made open access under one of our agreements earlier this year and is focused on the impact of long COVID on the UK workforce. Published in Applied Economic Letters earlier this year, it is already in the top 5% of all research outputs scored by Altmetric. It's also one of the highest scoring outputs from the source being the journal, and has a high attention score compared to outputs of the same age, which is important, as discussed earlier, as the longer articles have been around and been published, gives them more time to accrue engagement. But I think what's particularly interesting about this article is actually who has engaged with it on Twitter. So over 3,000 tweeters have shared this research output, which is shown in the blue on the altmetric ring there, in countries including the US, the UK, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Now, of these 3,058, to be precise, tweeters, 90%, or 2,743, were classified as members of the public, compared to 5% scientists, 3% practitioners, so that's doctors and other healthcare professionals, and 2% science commentators such as journalists, bloggers, and editors. So this shows how opening up critical research enables more people to have access to it than ever before, and this is only emphasised more in a global emergency like the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is an example of the kind of research made open access and how that's being accelerated through these agreements. Now I'm going to move on to talk about some specific case studies of 3 agreements looking at possible ways that we as a publisher would measure impact using real-life examples. So firstly, I will look at the impact on a subject area, politics. And as shown on the earlier slide, politics is the subject area with the second highest number of articles made open access through these agreements since 2020. And this example is from a partnership with a consortium which enables researchers to publish OA in our hybrid portfolio at no cost to themselves. 79% of articles made open access under this agreement in 2021 fall into a SSH subject category, with politics one of the most popular subjects for this country's research publishing with us. And around 10% of the article output from this country published in our politics journals was open access in 2020, the year before the agreement began, and this grew to 72% in 2021, so really significant growth in open access politics output from this particular consortium within the first year of the agreement. And again, because the barriers to access were removed, we started again to see the growth in altmetric tracked citations compared to the previous year. So we saw a growth of over 1,000 mentions of politics articles, including in social media, news stories, and policy documents, among others. And one example of an article that is relevant and timely for multiple audiences is shown on the screen there, and it's been mentioned by news outlets and blogs, has been shared on social media, and has already seen citations having been published this year. Secondly, we can look at the impact on global readership. So has the research that has been made open access been downloaded more in more countries and by people who perhaps otherwise would not have had access to it? So this is an example of our transformative agreement with The Ohio State University, and it was our first agreement, our first transformative agreement in the US, and their first transformative agreement as well. And it started in 2020. So the focus here is on the growth in global readership and the global access to content made open access. And in this agreement, 68% of publications fall into an HSS subject category. So firstly, the growth in downloads. There has been an almost 400% growth in total in-year downloads between 2019 and 2021, before and after the transformative agreement started. And this growth has been enabled due to the increase in the number of countries accessing the publications. 109 countries downloaded an Ohio State University published article in 2019, and in 2021, this increased to 185. So this clearly contributed to the increase in in-year downloads coming from outside the US, up from 43% in 2019 to 52% in 2021. Demonstrating how the agreement has increased global reach and readership of articles published by Ohio State. And looking at the top 30 countries that downloaded Ohio State University content over the 2 years, there were 7 new countries in the top 30 in 2021 compared to the top 30 in 2019. Now, 4 of these new 7 countries are World Bank-defined lower middle income countries. And one of these countries is the Philippines. And the Philippines was number 42 in terms of accessing Ohio State University content in 2019. And it rose to number 8 in 2021, with downloads increasing, albeit from a small base, 42 to over 2,588. And Indonesia is another example here. And Indonesia has increased from number 30 in terms of downloads in 2019 to number 10 now, rising from 90 downloads to 1,760 in 2021. So I think this shows how these agreements can help getting knowledge into the hands of people who otherwise arguably would not have had access to it, as demonstrated by the growth, but also, I think, critically, the increase in the global reach of where the content is being downloaded, which can help to contribute to global equity for research. And I think these numbers show how these agreements help to improve the discoverability of HSS and to raise awareness of the societal impact of these subject fields. And third and finally, open access agreements' influence on policy. So this is taken from our agreement with the Swedish consortium BIBSAM and is looking at their open access published articles with us since their agreement began in 2018. And since then, there have been nearly 7,000 policy citations on articles made open access under this agreement, according to the Overton database. And I think this shows the real-world applicability of research, with over 250 global individual sources citing this BIBSAM content. The most cited sources include the Publications Office of the European Union, the OECD, and UNESCO. And global citations also include the government of Kenya, the government of Uganda, and the governments of Canada and the UK. And of the top 3 journals that had the most citations in policy documents, 2 of them are in HSS subject areas. So these are regional studies and democratization. And one is science and technology, called climate policy. And again, this highlights the societal importance of opening up research in terms of it being referenced in policy documents globally and influencing global change. And we can also see the links between the different forms and formats of influence. So one of the articles most highly cited in this policy database in the journal Democratization is called "A Third Wave of Autocratization is Here, What is New About It?" And it was published in 2019. And not only has this been referenced in 1,100 policy documents, the latest being just a few weeks ago by the Norwegian government, But according to Altmetric, it's also been mentioned by nearly 90 news outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Indian Express. And it's also been mentioned nearly 400 times on Twitter. So I think when analysing the impact and influence of that transformative agreements can have on publishing, I think it's really important to place different metrics in conversation with each other. And I hope that these case studies have given you some indication of the ways in which we as a publisher look at impact and try to highlight the value of the research and the agreements to our library partners. So to conclude, this presentation has shown that open research is an extremely effective and impactful way to advance research and to share knowledge. And our transformative agreements, as one part of our broader open research strategy, have helped to accelerate open access in HSS subject areas by providing a funding route that matches researchers' appetite for open access. Thank you very much.